Welcome back to DK Sports Radio. You're listening to the Carter Six Pack. I'm Chris Carter, NFL analyst here at DKPittsburghSports.com. And then with the Carter Six Pack, we go through topics and we top the top 6 in those topics. We usually do a countdown. Today, a little bit different. This Carter Six Pack, we're going over 6 Black history facts on Pittsburgh sports. Now, getting into Black history, it is Black History Month at the time of this recording, but Pittsburgh has a rich history in Black history. There's a lot of stuff people you don't realize about the Hill District and the immense amount of jazz performers that used to come through here. The people that grew up in Pittsburgh, there's a lot to read about and to discover. We'll get into some of the different things that you can look up after this show. But we wanted to sort of celebrate Black History Month and talk about some of the great people and the great successes that have come through this city, and focusing on the sports aspect of it, being that we're at DK Pittsburgh Sports. So we're not going to do a countdown. We're just going to go through 6 different things that you might not know about, but you might want to look into after we talk about it. So with that said, let's get into it. We're starting at number 1.
Number one.
And we're going to start off with the rich history of the Negro Leagues here in Pittsburgh. Now, many people do know that there were 2 teams that were primary franchises in the Negro Leagues, those being the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays. But what you may not know is that between them, they had 13 titles in their span. The Crawfords were an organization that lasted a lot quicker. They went from 1931 to 1939. The Grays were a team that were banded together by a group of players back in the early 1900s, and then spanned all the way into the 40s, where they won a stretch of 11 titles in their time. But what's really awesome about these teams are the players that came through there. Players like Satchel Paige. Many people consider him the greatest pitcher of all time. And when people talk about Babe Ruth and his home run record, many people say, well, he didn't have to go against a pitcher like Satchel Paige. You always wonder what that would have been like. The Negro Leagues often fostered a lot of talent, but especially the 1932 Pittsburgh Crawfords had Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson, one of the most famed Negro League players of all time. He played catcher. He was only 20 years old at the time. He hit 8 home runs in that season, but he was a young player, hit over 300, and he eventually became the most famed hitter in Negro Leagues history. But on top of them, you had players like Rap Dixon, Oscar Charleston, John Henry Russell. There were several stars that came through both teams. And also, what people don't know is that with both the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords, because they were Negro League teams and they weren't owned by super rich owners and people that had that, they often ran into financial troubles. So on occasion, Art Rooney, the owner of the Steelers, would try to help him out because he was a huge Pittsburgh he was a huge baseball fan, and he loved seeing Pittsburgh sports succeed. So Gus Greenlee, the owner of the Crawfords, they said there were several times that he would try to do as much as he can to hold his roster together and make sure he could pay his players. There you go, Chris. And so sometimes Art Rooney would meet him at the Crawford Grill in the Hill District. That is where the team name came from. But they would meet there, and he would just give him money, not ask for no strings attached. So there was a lot of rooting for these 2 teams to succeed. The Homestead Grays lasted into the 40s. They both them and the Crawfords had superstar talent, and many say that to this day, had those teams been allowed to compete in the majors, they would have given several of those teams a run for money and might even won some titles.
Number 2.
Now, for number 2, we're jumping it forward in Pittsburgh baseball history. We're going to jump it forward to 1971. Did you know that in 1971, the Pittsburgh Pirates were the first team in Major League Baseball history to field an all-black starting lineup? That lineup included Rennie Stennett, Gene Clines, Roberto Clemente, Willie Stargell, Manny Sanguillen, Dave Cash, Al Oliver, Jackie Hernandez, and of course the superstar pitcher Doc Ellis. What many people don't know about that time and age, there wasn't exactly, yes, segregation was technically by law over, but there were still issues of division in the society, but especially in the world and the sports world too. Players didn't get to sleep in the same hotel still at that time, and Doc Ellis was a pitcher that let a lot of people know he'll get a a lot of fame because of the game that he pitched a not a perfect game, but a no hitter on LSD, and he gets a lot of popularity about that. But Doc Ellis stood up a lot for black rights and also getting black acknowledgement for his players in the major leagues. Players like Roberto Clemente, they did face a lot of racism in those days, and there was even other players. Like Madlock, they would come out and they said like that guy had to deal with so much. They tried to fool him. Mazeroski even stepped up for Clemente. He said that one time or several times early in his career, reporters would try to make him look bad because he was still learning English, and they would try to fool him with different dialects and try to get him to throw himself off and make him look bad. And Clemente said, "You can try to make me look bad as however you want. Yes, I'm black and Latino, but I'm still gonna be here and I'm still gonna ball." And there was several points, and if you look throughout those years where the Pittsburgh Pirates sort of banded together, and they won 2 titles in that era. They got 71 and 79, the 1960 World Series Clemente was part of also. But in 71, that's when they had the first all-black starting lineup, and they said it was not an accident. It was not they did that on purpose to make a statement and to make history on that day. Just shows there's a lot of Pittsburgh baseball history when people talk about it. You even talk about like play pieces of art like the play Fences. Written by August Wilson. They said that the main character of the story, which Denzel Washington played in the recent movie that remade the play, that was based off of Josh Gibson, the legendary catcher, and who they said there's a story that he hit a ball so far and so high they never found it, and that about a few days later they were playing in Cincinnati and a ball just fell out of the sky and was caught by an outfielder, and they said, "You're out from 3 days ago." But that's the thing is Pittsburgh baseball history spans all the way back to the early 1900s to all the way to now, and you can see in the 70s they were still relevant, and they had several superstar players. Roberto Clemente, chief among all of them. He died in flying in a plane back to earthquake victims in Nicaragua. Half black, half Puerto Rican. There's so much rich history there. I urge you to go to the Clemente Museum here in Pittsburgh. It's truly a great experience, and there's that. There's a lot of other places to check out here in Pittsburgh. There's a great piece, not a great piece, a great documentary called Wiley Avenue Days. It's old, it's from the 90s, but if you ever get around to checking it out, you'll learn a lot about the Pittsburgh Hill District and how that tied into not just the music scene, but also the sports scene here in the city.
Number 3.
And our third fact here in Pittsburgh Black sports history is Lowell Perry. Lowell Perry was the first African American assistant coach in the NFL. Yes, people will talk about Fritz Pollard being the first black head coach in the NFL for the Oakland Raiders, but it was Lowell Perry who was the first official coach in the league back in 1957. He was drafted by the Steelers back in 1956. 1953 with the 90th overall pick. He was drafted in the eighth round, but he didn't play until 1956 because he deferred going in for reserved officers training. He joined the United States Air Force and became a second lieutenant there, but came back. He did play for the Steelers for a little bit. He had a 93-yard return for a touchdown again in the preseason against the Lions, and in his first 6 games, he wasn't like superstar talent. The Steelers were not good back in the 50s. He had 14 catches for 334 yards, including a 75-yard touchdown catch against the Cleveland Browns. Back then, the Cleveland Browns were a powerhouse. But eventually, Perry got hospitalized after for 13 weeks because he suffered an injury. But then in June in 1957, he became a team's ends coach, and he became the first NFL black coach. And the assistant coach. He later went on shortly afterwards. He went and studied at Duquesne University School of Law. He received a law degree from Detroit College of Law in 1960. Became a law clerk for the U.S. District Court judge. And then eventually he went on to have a 17-year career with Chrysler. But he was a early staple of Pittsburgh black sports history, and not necessarily one that got a lot of note. But we're going to tie that in with the next fact because there's a lot of other black history coaching facts that we can get into.
Number 4.
And number 4 is moving a little bit forward, about 20 years. I guess more like 25 years or 26, maybe 30 years even. But we're looking at the future of black coaching history. Yes, we're going to get into Mike Tomlin in just a little bit, but let's start with the fact that Tony Dungy was brought in. He became the NFL's first African American head coach to win the Super Bowl. Yes, and that was a huge fact. That was a huge fact that everyone hyped on back when the Indianapolis Colts won in 2007. But many forget that he is part of the Chuck Noll coaching tree. When people talk about great coaches and the people that prospered out of them, there's a way that Chuck Noll kind of has a circle of life moment with the Pittsburgh Steelers, because he brought Tony Dungy. He brought Tony Dungy in as a defensive back for the Steelers, and they said immediately when he was on the team, he was asking questions and he was knowing how the defense worked, and he was a defensive back. He got a few Super Bowl rings with them, not all four, but in the 70s, he was a key piece, and then afterwards, he stayed on as an assistant coach, got his start there, helping out the defensive back, learning the defense, and then eventually, he developed what was called the Tampa 2 defense that he took with him to Tampa Bay. Now, here's where it gets a little circle of life. So Tony Dungy goes on to coach elsewhere. The Steelers, they get Bill Cowher in 1992, but Dungy goes and coaches for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where he hires, as a defensive backs coach, Mike Tomlin, and he got Mike Tomlin his first shot in the NFL. Mike Tomlin worked as a defensive back coach for the Buccaneers for 5 seasons, got a Super Bowl ring when they had 3 interceptions returned for a touchdown against the Oakland Raiders, but that was under John Gruden. He stayed on after Dungy left the Buccaneers. And then after 2005, Mike Tomlin got 1 year as the defensive coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings, and then in 2007, he was hired as the Pittsburgh Steelers head coach, and the rest is history. Going on with 11 straight seasons with not having a losing record, something that only Curly Lambeau has done in NFL history. He also has the most wins outside of Don Shula in his first 11 seasons in the NFL. Truly excellence in the sport of football and in coaching. But it's all crazy because Chuck Noll was the guy that brought in Tony Dungy and showed him how to play the game. And, well, Dungy already knew his stuff, but he certainly learned a lot under Noll. And then as time went on, Dungy brought Tomlin in, taught him his way of working. Dungy went on to win a Super Bowl. Then the very next Super Bowl, Tomlin goes on to when it sort of grandfathered in under Chuck Noll's coaching tree. So lots of interesting stuff there, and it's always been a source of pride for a lot of black Pittsburghers, including myself, that the Pittsburgh Steelers can lay claim to that history.
Number 5.
And coming in at number 5, we're gonna take it all the way back to the very start of the Steelers franchise back in 1933 when they were the Pittsburgh Pirates, named after the successful baseball club at the time. We're gonna take it back to Raymond Howard Kemp. Now, you may not know this, but Raymond Howard Kemp was a tackle that played on the very first Steelers, or technically Pirates, football team. And he was the first black member. He's a charter member of the football team, and he's the first black player in team history. He played tackle. He was born in 1907, passed away in 2002. He was a 6'1", 215-pound lineman out of Duquesne. He's from Cecil, Pennsylvania. Also went to Lincoln, or as coached at Lincoln, the historically black college in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the second historically black college, the second oldest historically black college. But he played for the Duquesne Dukes, then played on for the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he was with the Rooneys, and then eventually. He eventually went on. He was put on the reserve list after his time with the Steelers, and went on to be a coach for quite some time. But it should not be passed that Raymond Howard Kemp is the first ever black Steeler in team history, and he went on to coach for quite a few years in college football.
Number 6.
Now, spring it forward way down the line to when the Steelers rose to power in the 1970s. We're going to make this our final fact on black history in this show on Bill Nunn. Now, Bill Nunn was a writer for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was at the time it was the oldest running black newspaper in the country, and it made a lot of headwaves because what Bill Nunn did was he studied historically black colleges and universities. Now, for those who don't know, I went to an historically black college university. That was Cheney University, and that's actually the oldest HBCU. That's the short acronym for that. In the country. It was founded in 1837. But what Bill Nunn did was he went around, because no one talked about the players coming from these colleges enough in his mind, because there were plenty of top players that were coming out of these schools. And one thing that Bill Nunn did was he created a top 100 HBCU players. It was like a whole article that he put together, and he listed and ranked them, players of that year, and that helped gain awareness for a lot of these players that weren't getting a lot of looks, because everyone was looking at the super schools, the Michigans, the Ohio States, the University of Pittsburghs, the Penn States, and across the league, and the USCs and things like that. But a lot of places like Howard, Grambling, North Carolina A&T, Cheney, Lincoln, those type of schools didn't get the look-see, and Bill Nunn started that column, and eventually went from just being an article that he wrote every year to becoming a full-on convention where he would bring those players in, and they would get awards, and it would boost up the awareness of those players. And eventually Dan Rooney came to him and said, "Hey, man, I really like your work. We haven't seen you at the Steelers facility in a long time." He's like, "Yeah, because you guys won't respect my credentials when because I'm showing them from the Courier." And when Rooney realized that the Steelers organization was shutting out the only black newspaper in Pittsburgh, he immediately said, "Well, okay, we want to end that." And he actually talked to Bill Nunn. He said, "Hey, we love your eye. We love your work in the Pittsburgh Courier. We want to bring you on as a scout." And Bill Nunn came on as a scout for the Steelers, and eventually would lead the renaissance as far as bringing HBCU players into the NFL, because HBCU players weren't given as much looks, but the Steelers found out about and were able to get access to a lot of players that became superstars of that 70s team. And what was chief among them, John Stallworth, coming for an HBCU. It was a small Alabama A&M down south. He was a superstar receiver there. Bill Nunn supposedly found the tape of him and hid it from the rest of the NFL, because he said they did not want to do it. And during the draft, in the 1974 draft, that is the greatest year of a draft of a single team of all time. The Steelers went and got Lynn Swann with number 1. Bill Nunn protested and was telling Chuck Noll they need to draft him every single round, because he knew that John Stallworth was going to be a superstar wide receiver. But Noll and the Steelers, they held on. They drafted Swann in the first, Lambert in the second, and everyone knows how great he was as a linebacker. They later would draft Mike Webster in the same draft, and of course they went and got John Stallworth in the 4th round, and they were just surprised that no one took him, but partially maybe because that film wasn't out there for other people to study. And then eventually they got Donnie Shell, another HBCU player, as an undrafted player after the draft. And there were several pieces that added to their team, as well as the Cowboys team, that were HBCU talents. Then in the years coming, then NFL teams started to realize, whoa, we're overlooking this huge bank of talent. And eventually players like Walter Payton and Jerry Rice, also HBCU players, would get into the league, and they'd become superstars, arguably the greatest at their positions in the history of the game. But you look at that history. Bill Nunn led that charge and took the Steelers led them into an era where they were able to get the head out and get the HBCU players, and some of those players were the reasons why they were able to become such a great dynasty in the 1970s. And you have to wonder what would have been like. What would the Steelers have been like without a John Stallworth? And that's something that I think takes honor. And if you want a little Easter egg trivia, so if you don't know, Bill Nunn's son, Bill Nunn Jr., went on to be an actor, and he did some movies like Sister Act, and he did what was it called? The Do the Right Thing from Spike Lee. He also did School Days from Spike Lee. Several interesting movies, but there's really, and I always liked him and for the characters that he played. But in quite a few of them, you could see him in like little passing shots, and the ones that weren't prominent scenes or anything. Like if he was just in the background, he'll be wearing Steelers gear. to honor his father and the work that he did for the Steelers. And his father was a legendary writer. He went on to head the Pittsburgh Courier for many years, which is one of the most respected news outlets at the time. So a lot of great history, and that's why we wanted to end it on Bill Nunn bringing HBCU players to the forefront in the NFL and changing the era. And now people don't pass up as many of those players when it comes to, one, getting them into college, but also making sure that those players can transition into the NFL. Well, that was our 6th Black History Sports Fact. We hope you learned a thing or two. I encourage you, go to the Clementi Museum, look up documentaries, look up Doc Ellis, look more into the 1971 baseball team. Doc Ellis also made a lot of pushes. Bill Madlock was another guy that said he was going to come home with the All-Star Game MVP. And there's a lot of stories about how Black Pittsburgh sports was more progressive than any other place, but also they overcame more obstacles than many people give them credit for. So from the Carter Six-Pack, happy Black History Month. We hope you learned a thing or two. We encourage you to keep learning out there because there's so much rich history about Pittsburgh. Thanks. Keep listening to DK Sports Radio.